named because they are cavities between two sheets of connective tissue that cover the brain, and those are called the dura, okay? White sheets of dura mater, it's called. You take those two sheets and you make a little, you kind of like split them, and they make a little cavity, and that's called the sinus. Now the function of the dural sinuses is to take blood back from the cerebral circulation, okay? So the cerebral arteries that you've been learning about coming off the circle of Willis, that's how the blood gets to the brain. Then it goes to the different cranial arteries that feed the different lobes. And once that blood is used up, it goes back into the sinuses, and ultimately the sinuses pretty much all drain into the internal jugular, and then that leaves the cranial vault. So the sinuses, the biggest one that you can see is right up here, and you should see that blue line, or blue line roughly where I'm tracing. Okay, that's called the superior sagittal sinus, and it runs right between the two cerebral hemispheres. So because it runs anteriorly, posteriorly, in our cross-sectional head here, we're not going to see the whole thing, but if we open it up, we'll see you'll see the posterior and the anterior part of it. Okay, so that's an arc that runs along here. So that's your superior sagittal sinus. If I ask that one on a test, it's almost always on this, up there. Okay? So blood from the superior part of the brain would drain into that, and then they would flow. It flows backwards, posteriorly. And as it flows posteriorly, it courses down along back by the occipital bone, where eventually we get down to a point where it meets this funky thing. Okay? It's like a big M. Okay? So that superior sagittal sinus flows backwards to here. And this area right here is called the confluence of the sinuses. And that's where the superior sagittal sinus meets this thing called the transverse sinus. Right? And when you studied the occipital bone in A&P1, you might have learned about those nuchal lines, they're called. Okay? The superior nuchal lines are ridge that you can see along the back of the occipital bone. Well, that happens to correspond with where this sinus runs on the inside. Okay? So that's your transverse sinus. And it goes over to just behind the ear. Okay? Where it gets to the point where it's behind the ear, it turns 90 degrees and goes down, okay? like a downspout of a gutter. That downspout is the beginning of the next sinus, called the sigmoid sinus. So we drop down through the gutter there, and then we get to one that has this zigzag lightning bolt appearance. So now we've come through the transverse sinus, we've dropped down to here, and then we flow through this little zigzaggy shape here, and that's the sigmoid sinus for S-shaped, right? You got one of those on each side. And then when that gets to the end of the sigmoid sinus, that's the beginning of the internal jugular, and that takes the blood out of the brain then. Okay? So that's the main route that we go: superior sagittal, confluence, transverse, sigmoid, jugular. Then we can throw in a few other sinuses that feed into that. Okay? So we'll come back up a little bit. So now we've elevated back up a little bit. Not quite up to the level of the transverse sinus, but a little bit below that. And now I'm going to ask you to recall some more A&P1 knowledge. Anybody remember what these cavities we're seeing here are called?
Ethmoid?
These are the, well, you're close. These are maxillary. These are not ethmoidal, but these are sphenoidal. The ethmoid are a little higher. So these are the perinasal sinuses. Those are those air pockets that you have in the bones. Good, that was good. Well, around those, now you have to kind of visualize what we're doing. We're going through the bone layer, so now we've passed through the bone, and we're into the cranial cavity. There are blood vessels in there. This is the internal carotid that we're looking at. Well, around that are a collection of these kind of loose bulbous veins, and they are called the cavernous sinuses collectively. Okay, these little loose veins around there. It's called a cavernous sinus. And they form big kind of pouches, which is why it's called cavernous. Well, they take their blood and they travel back through a sinus that goes over the temporal bone, and this is one you don't have to know, but it's called the petrosal sinus, because part of the temporal bone is called the petrosal portion. So it flows over that until it meets up with the sigmoid sinus, and that's how that blood gets out. There's another way we can go. We can go back underneath the cerebellum, and that sinus that goes from the cavernous sinus back is called the straight sinus. Okay? And all we can see is just that little bit of it here. That's the straight sinus. Okay? So I think the ones that I asked you to know are the superior sagittal, confluence and transverse, sigmoidal, cavernous, and straight. I think those are the ones that I put in the list. Okay. If you want me to go over it again on an individual basis, I'll be happy to. But that's where you're going to find them.
And
That's the model you do.
yeah, it would be tested on the bottom.
So I use either of these two. Okay, the superior sagittal, like I said, I usually do on here. You can also see, if you take the brain out and look in there, you can also see the straight sinus. But cavernous, sigmoidal, transverse, they all have to be on here.
What about the veins? Because it's labeled underneath the like.
Well, sinuses are veins.
Well, it says like azygous vein, hemiazygous.
Well, those are on the models.
Okay.
Right. Those are not in the. Those are in the chest. Okay. Anything else? I feel like I should say more. That's it.